Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We meet today thanks to the generosity of Professor Quentin Skinner. He's unable to be here today. He sends his apologies, but this is because of a long-standing commitment in foreign climes. In 2006, Professor Skinner, then Regius Professor of History at the University of Cambridge, was awarded, famously, the Balzan Prize in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the history of political thought. He, with consummate generosity, then dedicated that prize to two projects. The first was a series of 4 international conferences at which literally dozens of young scholars met to explore the place of religious and political liberty in early modern Europe. These discussions issued in the 2 imposing and prodigious volumes edited by Quentin Skinner and Martin van Helderen and published by Cambridge University Press in 2013 under the title Freedom and the Construction of Europe. The second of Professor Skinner's projects was, of course, ours, the establishment of the Balzan Skinner Fellowship, to allow one young scholar each year to spend a term's leave here at Crash, and, of course, to give a keynote lecture at a concluding colloquium. Anna Becker, whom we welcome back to Cambridge today from the University of Basel, where she's a lecturer in early modern history, was the 6th Balzan Skinner Fellow, after Hannah Dawson, Joel Isaac, Tim Stanton, Gabrielle Paquette, and Karina Mantena. Dr. Becker completed her BA at Bonn University in 1999. After an Erasmus year in Milan, she spent 5 years at the Free University of Berlin's Otto Suhr Institute before coming to Lucy Cavendish College to do her MPhil, a gateway to so many glittering careers in intellectual history and political thought here in Cambridge. In 2010, she completed her doctorate under the supervision of Annabel Brett on gender and political thought in northern Italy and France from about 1420 to about 1586, a dissertation I had the pleasure and the profit of examining. In her dissertation, Dr. Becker explored the tradition of Aristotelian and pseudo-Aristotelian reflection on the household and family in later medieval and Renaissance political thought. Her technically virtuoso and thematically very wide-ranging study revealed the porosity of several conceptual boundaries, frequently regarded as absolute, above all that of the family and civitas. The 4 articles she's published to date on the strength of her doctoral research address masculinity in the political thought of Machiavelli, marriage and rule in Jean Baudin's political thought, as well as the relationship between economics, perhaps I should say oikonomics, and politics in Baudin's thought, and the role of gender as a differentiating characteristic. The word she uses in her title is Markierung in the political thought of the Renaissance more generally. In her lecture today, Dr. Becker will bring into sharper focus several of the questions emerging from her doctoral and subsequent research. In general, she's going to be reflecting on how marriage and politics are interrelated. More specifically, by interrogating the role of gender in a rather more forceful way than she was able to do in her doctorate, gender in early modern political thought, she hopes to prompt some reflections on and challenge the stability of some familiar dichotomies, all too familiar perhaps to us, family and city, private and public, and thus she wants to cast new light on the political space itself. It was an enormous pleasure to have Anna back in Cambridge for the duration of her fellowship. The colloquium she's organised for us today is a fitting culmination of that fellowship and a characteristic expression of her enthusiasm and energy. She's going to be speaking for, 50 minutes? 50 minutes before taking questions. At 12:30, we'll break for lunch and reconvene at 1:30 to hear our other speakers, Serena Ferrante, Silvana Tomaselli, and Claire Chambers. We begin, therefore, with Dr. Anna Becker, whose lecture, just to remind you and to invite her to the podium with all due formality, is entitled Gender in the History of Early Modern Political Thought.
Well, thank you so much, Magnus, for that wonderful introduction. And also I would first of all like to express my deepest gratitude to Professor Quentin Skinner, who cannot be here today, as Magnus said, for instituting this fellowship. The Balzan Skinner Fellowship is really a wonderful opportunity to spend a term purely dedicated to research And I was really so grateful to be able to come back to Cambridge for a term. I tremendously enjoyed my time here and benefited immensely from this most stimulating intellectual environment. But I also would like to thank Professor Skinner more personally for the generous encouragement he showed always towards my project. I would also like to thank the Balzan Skinner Committee, of course Annabel Brett, John Robertson and Magnus Ryan, for coordinating the fellowship and for making me feel very welcome in the history faculty and for providing me with great conversations and also great lunches. I also would like to thank Simon Goldhill, who should be here, and everybody at Crash for not only giving me a physical space to work, but also for connecting me to a true interdisciplinary academic community. I think Crash is really an exceptional place, and I really benefited so much from the exchange with my colleagues here. And at Crash, my warmest thanks, of course, go out to Michelle Maciejewska, who did such a wonderful job organizing, coordinating, and managing not only the fellowship, but mainly this conference today. So thank you so much. And finally, of course, my deep thanks to the speakers, Serena Ferrente, Silvana Tomaselli, Claire Chambers, and Carol Attack in absentia, unfortunately, for their willingness to speak today and engage in this conversation. And it goes without saying that I'm very much looking forward to all of your talks and your input. So, but before that, 50 minutes of how to write gender in the history of political thought. In her 1986 article, Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysis, Joan Scott's most important contention was that gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power. Warning against the dangers of trusting essentialist notions of man and woman, she called for historical contextualization of assumingly natural categories, male and female, and their relationship with hierarchies, power, and ultimately political institutions. Motivated by the desire to look at the patriarchal foundation of the state, research in the 1980s had mainly tried to expose the exclusion of women from positions of power in politics or in economic life. While these were incredibly helpful studies, by the time she was writing her article, Scott bemoaned that this had led to historical scholarship that was merely a footnote to the prevailing political, economic, or social historical narratives. Gender, she contended, therefore, was not just another word for women, or a more polite word for sex. Rather, it was a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between the sexes. Gender needed to be seen as one of the recurrent references by which political power has been conceived, legitimated, and criticized. The idea that political power and gender share an intrinsic connection and are interrelational has been explored in a multitude of ways in historical scholarship since then. Influenced by Foucault and his studies of the dispersed and non-uniform dynamics of power, works in cultural history have focused on understanding processes and structures of power and agency to understand in what way political institutions were made and shaped by gendered subjects, who in turn were made and shaped by those gendered institutions. The picture that emerges shows complex, fluid, and highly ambiguous relationships of gender and political power that do not offer simple tales of female subjection and male dominance in the political sphere. However, once we are turning to the history of political thought, it does not seem as if Scott's analysis has had much influence, at least not in the history of early modern political thought in the 15th and 16th century. Although excellent studies in intellectual history approach the complex notion of women or woman, or of Renaissance feminism and misogynism, the focus in relation to the political was mainly to show the exclusion of women as agents from the sphere of politics and focused on how that exclusion was constructed by male agents. This seems of course to be directly proven in our sources, as the following quote from Leonardo Bruni's De Studiis et Litteris from 1424 shows, in which the author expressed that women should not train in the art of rhetorics, the ultimate art of politics. Quote, "For why should the subtleties of the ars rhetorica waste a woman's time? For she never sees the forum. A woman should not trouble herself with that art of delivery. If she should gesture wildly with her arms as she spoke, or if she elevated herself, shouting violently, she would be seen as mad and put under restraint. The contests of the forum, like those of warfare and battle, are the things of men. Therefore, she will leave the roughness of the forum entirely to them." End quote. So the world of the forum, another word for politics, is hence, in the words of the quintessential 15th century Florentine civic humanist, a world of men, in which women simply could not participate, however capable they might be deemed. And indeed, Battista Malatesta, the addressee of De Studiis et Litteris, was deemed a very capable woman. After all, the sort of intellectual tradition for which the writings of Leonardo Bruni paradigmatically stand emphasized and reappraised politics as a life of active participation in the city and a keen engagement with its affairs, deeply opposed not only to the life of the household, but also to the sort of contemplative life that shunned any entanglement with the civic. And for this intellectual tradition, I've used the contested term civic humanism, and I shall also use another contested one, Renaissance republicanism, and I hope you forgive me today if I continue to use them as a shorthand for those kinds of writing that emphasized civic activity, glory, and the liberty of the city. In the narrative of civic humanism and Renaissance republicanism, thinkers, especially through their exploration of Aristotelian political thought, are seen to have constructed this political and active life as taking place in a sphere that was sharply distinguished from and in complete opposition to the social, the private, thus the life of household and family. Household and family is understood to be the sphere of women, the feminine sphere that has nothing to do with politics and that is its polar opposite. Easily mapped onto this dichotomy of household and politics, then, are the categories of female and male that seem to be equally and solidly opposed to each other. Any study that wants to say anything about the gender dimension of early modern political thought must hence necessarily look again at those spheres and re-examine and contextualize them. The understanding of the dynamics of the opposition between the political and the domestic as a feature of ancient thought has been powerfully laid down by Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition. There, Arendt had argued that brought down to us from the worlds of the Greek city-states, and most notably expressed in the works of Aristotle, especially by his notion of man as zoon politikon, was the idea that humans can fulfill their potential only in a sphere of politics that was not weighed down by what she thought were the necessities of natural life. The household, she argued, was so sharply distinguished from the political and truly human that it did not even appear to be a genuinely human sphere in Greek philosophy. It existed solely to provide social companionship. But this was a trait human beings shared with animals. The private realm of the household, Arendt wrote, quote, was the sphere where the necessities of life, of individual survival, as well as of continuity of the species, were taken care of and guaranteed. One of the characteristics of privacy was that man existed in this sphere not as truly human being, but only as a specimen of the animal species mankind. And this is the ultimate reason for the tremendous contempt held for it by antiquity, end quote. So the household, the sphere of women, at least in Arendt's reading of Aristotle, seems to exist as an almost inhuman sphere, hardly distinguished from the life of animals, and it certainly had nothing whatsoever in common with the political, the realm of men. And I'm here not at all interested in a critique of Arendt's handling of Aristotle, since she neither wrote as a classicist nor as a historian, and she was deeply motivated by contemporary concerns that probably required her harsh dichotomical thinking. But I do think that Arendt's analysis is worth mentioning here, since it influences the historical narrative of Renaissance political thought, at least insofar as it is seen as a rebirth of Aristotelian moral philosophy. Most famously, J.J.A. Pocock, in his Machiavellian Moment, one of the most influential accounts of Renaissance political thought, acknowledged Arendt as an inspiration. He wrote in his 2002 afterword to the Machiavellian Moment that he was telling the story of the revival of ancient political thought, quote, in terms borrowed from or suggested by the language of Hannah Arendt, end quote. And it is not incidental that in a recent article he expressed, quote, I had found in Aristotle's politics the most satisfying theory of the active citizen I had or have encountered, that in which he was an equal, ruling over equals, and so ruled by them, and finding in the exercise and enjoyment of this equality a freedom and authority necessary to the nature of the human being. But he inserted a bracket into this sentence that made clear that while he as an equal ruled over equals, she had yet to be included. We should of course ask ourselves how a political sphere that was so satisfyingly characterized by notion of equality, while being completely masculine and diametrically opposed to a non-political female world, can really be seen as an expression of equality. If so, what then is the content of the Renaissance notion of equality? Can this theory still be most satisfying? Can woman, who is not yet included, just hope that she will be included one day? Do we simply trust a narrative of progress here? And at this point, we need to question and rethink the narrative of exclusion and inclusion that is pivotally tied to the idea of a political versus an apolitical sphere, which seem to fundamentally structure early modern ideas of human lives and politics. Joan Scott had argued that if political power indeed needed gender for its vindication, then the reference must seem sure and fixed outside human construction, part of the natural and divine order. But then the universality of gender relationship becomes a political category, which itself needs to be the object of historization. Now, this does not seem to be very far from what lies at the heart of the history of political thought and the way that it is practiced here at Cambridge. Historians of political thought are motivated to understand the historical construction of political concepts, their language and their discourse. We look at the contingency of political concepts and question both the notion of universally accepted ideas or categories as well as their timeless truths. We know that political categories, and that includes the sphere of the political, are never constructed without argument and contest. If the category of the political and the way it relates to gender seems so fixed and determined, then it needs in itself a contextualization. Thinking about gender in the history of political thought, thus, requires an examination of our assumption of the presumed dichotomy of the public, political, and the private household, and their respective masculine and feminine natures. Therefore, we necessarily must look at the foundations of politics as conceived by Renaissance thinkers. If we rediscover, reconstruct, and properly contextualize the discourse about what the political was seen to be, we might be able to examine its relation with gender in a new way. With this, we can indeed approach gender and political thought in a way that transcends the question of the inclusion or exclusion of women. And I shall do so today mainly by way of commentaries on Aristotle's politics in the 15th and 16th century. They do not only offer the early modern Aristotelian perspective that is needed to deconstruct and historicize the categories that Hannah Arendt and her followers so successfully employed and employ, Commentaries also work consciously with language. In 15th century Florence, the project was mainly to translate the Greek into Ciceronian Latin, as opposed to the barbaric Latin of the medieval forerunners. Matters of translation and of vocabulary, therefore, were highly significant and were paid much attention. If we can learn anything about the construction of a gendered language of the political, it's here. I shall thus, in what follows, follow early modern thinkers in their employment of language that shape political concepts, and so show that indeed the political was constructed along gendered lines in early modern political thought, so that gender and politics emerge as relational categories at the beginning of the modern state. My intention is to show that gender indeed function as a signifier of political power. And I shall do so by way of two deconstructions and one reconstruction. So I first would like to examine the assumed fixed dichotomy of the two spheres, the domestic and the political, and show how these spheres relate to each other in very different ways than an Arendtian reading of Renaissance sources suggests. In a second step, I shall then examine the assumed dichotomy of the female and the political, and show how that relationship was seen in early modern commentaries. After this exercise in deconstruction, I shall then, in a third step, reconstruct. I shall then not provide a narrative of exclusion of women from politics, but will follow early modern thinkers in showing how women were in fact included in the realm of the political. So let us start then with one of the most enticing features of Aristotelian political thought, the idea that man is a political animal, a zoon politikon. As the commentator Pierre Vettori wrote, man is an animal of the city and made to live with other human beings. I shall speak in what follows about the city quite often, since it's the closest English translation for civitas, as the Latin rendering of polis, and as such the term for that what we would understand as the political. In the Aristotelian tradition, the city, or the political, took its strengths, its particularity, and indeed the justification of its existence from its naturalness. A human being was a political animal by nature, and thus his and her political characteristic was both a characteristic peculiar to human beings alone, that is, as opposed to animals, and it was natural. Nature, then, was not at all constructed in opposition to the political, as Arendt had suggested. Rather, politics was an expression of nature. The political nature of human beings was discussed in the commentaries on Aristotle's practical philosophy, namely in commentaries to the three Aristotelian texts, the Politics, the Nicomachean Ethics, and the Oeconomics. The latter book was, in the 15th and 16th century, thought to be genuinely by Aristotle, and it provided the full Aristotelian picture of the art of the household, the res familiaris, and the domestic sphere. The three books related directly to the moral examination of the threefold life of man, as the scholar and commentator Agostino Nifo called it. Man's life in the household, his vita oeconomica, was the middle between his vita monastica, his individual, and his vita civilis, or civilis, his political life. The Italian Protestant author Peter Vermigli described this relationship. Quote, "Among these three moral subjects, the first place is surely held by ethics, then economics, and finally politics. I see this order as circular. Through ethics, those who are its students will, one by one, become good men. If they prove upright, they will raise good families. If the families are properly established, they will in turn create good republics. And in good republics, both law and administration will aim at nothing less than each man becoming a good citizen, for they have eyes not only for the body, but also for the spirit, and they will take care that citizens live according to virtue." And of course, the way citizens live according to virtue is again the thing of ethics, so that the circle becomes complete. We see here at the outset that the full life of human beings needed to have 3 and not 2 components: an ethical, an economical, and a political component. The political and the economical, or the domestic, that is the sphere of the household, are not at all oppositions, but links that are intricately connected with each other. But these 3 dimensions were all necessary to the full human life. To be virtuous, hence, a human being needed both ethics, all 3, ethics, household, and politics. The household, therefore, was not a subhuman sphere, but, and this was regularly commented upon in the commentaries, the household was tightly connected to the good life and the common good of the city. We are used to locate the care for the good life to the political sphere only, but Renaissance Aristotelians placed its care equally in the household. The Ferrara statesman and philologist Antonio Montecatini, for instance, stated that the single man, the homo singulo, was not wholly solitary, but lives most of the time in society, certainly in the civil and domestic society, without which neither the good life nor good deeds are completely possible. Virtue thus needed a social life, not only a political one. Without them, no morally good life was possible. But the relationship of the social, another word of Arendt's that she connected to the household, with the political was quite direct. As the Basel philologist and playwright Sixtus Burke wrote, "Men are political because they are social beings." The household then certainly could not seem to these Aristotelians as an animal, as a subhuman, animal-like subhuman space. What differentiates us from other gregarious animals, Aristotle had said, was the capability for speech, reason, and justice. Emphasized in the commentaries then was that this was not only the mark of the political, as we today are used to think about it, but equally that of the household. As Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples wrote in 1506, "It is peculiar to men before the other animals that they alone have the perception of the good and the bad, the just and the unjust, and other things of this sort, and through the sharing of this, they bring about household and city." The capability for moral examination of our action was thus a necessary requirement for life in the household, and not only a signifier of the political sphere. And as a last point in this section, I would like to point out that, related to the points before, is that in early modern Aristotelian thinking, we do not find the domestic as cast in the language of the private. So when Donato Acciaioli discussed the relationship of the 3 spheres of practical moral philosophy, he described ethics as the disciplina privata, whereas economics was disciplina domestica, politics was the disciplina civilis. The private thus only referred here to what Montecatini had called the single man, that is when turning one's perspective at individual virtues. But they, of course, only came, as we heard, to the fore in the context of society, and through the medium of domestic were made to benefit the common good in the city. So the sphere of the household certainly was not a very private sphere in 15th and 16th century Aristotelian political thought. In early modern commentaries, we then do not encounter a stark opposition of the political and the domestic, and we also cannot attest that the latter was held in contempt. Rather, it was seen as constitutive for the political and interrelated with the political in a multitude of ways, and both, of course, were important for the formation of a third sphere, that of individual ethics. The domestic was both the seedbed or the seminarium from which the city originated, but it was also needed for its running, for the forming of good citizens, and so for the common good. As Leonardo Bruni emphasized, there would be no city if there were no households. And here then we are coming to the second point that I'd like to make. Since the spheres are highly interrelated and very hard to entangle, or in other words, since they seem to be shifting, the question presents itself: what happens with the narrative of the exclusion of women from the public sphere? Is the female really absolutely opposed to the political? Together with an exploration of the interdependence of household and politics, commentators indeed also explored what was seen as the household's most important relationship in detail, namely that of husband and wife. Far from understanding the role of marriage as purely ancillary to the formation of cities or of politics, commentators showed that it was exactly marriage, the natural conjunction of men and women, that did not only make cities emerge, but was already an expression of the civic or political nature of human beings. If human beings were political by nature, then what made them form cities needed to relate to their political nature. They hence showed over and over again, in the words of Acciaioli, quote, that human beings were both conjugal animal and civil animal, end quote. These categories did not reflect oppositions, but rather deeply ingrained natural characteristics that were seen as fundamentally related. The relationship of politics and household was thus negotiated through a gender relationship, that between husband and wife. And this is very clearly brought out in Bruni's vernacular writings. In his Vita di Dante e Petrarca, Bruni stated that, quote, man is a civic animal, so say all philosophers. For the first conjunction is that of husband and wife, from which multiplicated is born the city, and nothing can be perfect where this is not. Man is a civil or political animal, but only because he is a conjugal one first. Marriage is part of the civic nature of man, and thus has a function for civic life. It's the birthplace of the city, but through its offspring it cares for the city and renders it alive and flourishing. The problem that most of the commentators approached first was, however, that human couples shared the principle of procreation with animals, so that the conjugal relationship between husband and wife might be said to not represent a genuinely human trait. Aristotle had stated that the union of male and female is very much according to nature, a union of necessity. It was essential for reproduction and was not a matter of choice, since human beings share this with animals and plants. But the commentators, to emphasize that human beings are by nature political, they also wanted to show that human marriage was much more than simple animal-like coupling. Here, the pseudo-Aristotelian oikonomika was routinely used to underpin and flesh out the content of the politics, since it contained a rich account of the internal dynamics of the conjugal society, which proved crucial to an examination of the nature of political rule. In it, the conjugal relationship was described indeed as a union, but of husband and wife, providing each other with more mutual help, affection, and cooperation, so that the human couple had a more perfect bond with each other than other tame animals, since the human partnership did not merely ensure existence through procreation and thus kept the species alive, but it existed for the good life. These important qualifications were consequently emphasized and expanded. When Lefebvre d'Etaples laid down that the human couple did not exist for living only, but for the good life, he consciously drew parallels to Aristotle's Politics, in which the city is defined as, quote, coming to be for the sake of life and existing for the sake of the good life. So marriage works here quite similar and is very related to the city. Again, we can see that the good life was not at all understood as part of the political sphere only, but we can also see what its connection to the household was. The good life flows directly and crucially from the relationship of husband and wife. For the human couple, procreation was not at all the only reason for being together and sharing a life. The married couple is described as leading a life which consisted of mutuality and cooperation, not of hostile opposition. And this was needed for the concord of the city. This view situated the care for the good life in marriage, which was in this way deeply connected to the political life. Early modern Aristotelians also did not care very much that the politics had said that the conjunction of male and female was not one by choice. Rather, they emphasized that it was exactly the element of choice that signaled the human union of husband and wife. Acciaioli's commentary on the politics stressed that while the simple act of conjunction for the sake of procreation was universally shared with animals, quote, nevertheless, this conjunction can be perfected by choice when one spouse consents to the other. The specific human formation of marriage was expressed as a voluntary agreement between the spouses that required active consent, cum conjux in conjugam consented, and thus hence demanded a couple that shared in reason fairly equally. Commentators operated with terms like choice, consent, reason, and law when reflecting on the conjugal relationship, and therefore clearly differentiating it from a realm that shared much with animals, and thus transporting it very close to the sphere of the civitas. It was not only seen as functioning according to similar principles, but also understood as an important part of the civitas and part of the perfection of man towards good life. And the language that the commentators use to describe the human couple is very telling. They did not operate indiscriminately with broad categories of the male, the female. Of course, when talking about the natural principle of conjunction for the end of procreation, the vocabulary is about the broad masculus et femina. But when the commentators talk about the civilized gender relationship, about the good life, and elements of law, the vocabulary employed is that of husband and wife, that of maritus and marita, vir and uxor, mulia, and conjux, the latter one word that bears both genders, masculine and feminine in the Latin. It seems thus that the commentators did not operate with the category woman, at least not when they were talking about the civilized, civic, and domestic spheres. Woman is not a category of the civil, which was not shaped by a simple biological essentialism, although it was shaped by nature. The linguistic differentiations were both nuanced and pronounced, and so was early modern thinking about gender, and not women only, even in the context of Aristotle's politics. Relatedly, the categories of male and female, and also wife and husband, do not map so easily onto the categories of the political and the household. In our analysis, the categories were not fixed but seem permeable. So great is their interrelatedness. Early modern thinkers emphasized equally the categories, the interdependence of the categories of husband and wife, both with the political sphere and also with each other. Husband and wife seem to share the same sphere, mainly that of the household, but the boundaries between household and politics were shifting and transient and not very fixed and permanent. So, having thus deconstructed the spheres or the dichotomy of public and private and that of woman, we might want to reconstruct a part of the narrative by seeing in what way gender is a category for the political. So in the last part, I would therefore like to turn to the question of the political nature of the relationship of male and female, or more correctly, that of husband and wife. The relationship of husband and wife, as we've seen, is not only the foundation of the city, but synonymous and foundational for political power. Renaissance thinkers were prompted by Aristotle to use the relationship in the family to explore the very nature of rule, of all rule, and especially political rule. Aristotle had used the family to explain the different kinds of rule in the city, having stated in Nicomachean Ethics, one can also find in households resemblances to these political systems and, as it were, models of them. In the politics, rule in the household was twofold. It was divided between rule over unfree people, i.e. slaves, and over free subjects, rule over children and rule over wives, and I think we are going to hear more about that later. But rule over free persons was equally sharply divided. In the translation of Leonardo Bruni, the pater familias rules over both wife and children as free persons, but not in the same sort of rule, imperium. For the wife is ruled constitutionally, while the children are ruled monarchically. The head of the household, wrote Bruni, was, quote, a monarch in his house, a domus sua rex. However, Aristotle had specifically, Bruni wrote, excluded the wife from that power of her husband, because, quote, he does not have imperium over his wife in the same way in which he has imperium over his children. In the commentaries, the contrast between the power of the pater familias over his household and the very specific rule of husbands over their wives was stressed. The husband-to-wife relationship was decidedly and fundamentally different from that of the pater familias to his children and that of the master to his slaves. The reason was that the husband's relationship over the wife was civilita. Civilis was the translation of the Greek politikos. Older translations of Aristotle indeed had the Latinate word politicus instead. So civilis or politicus signified the statesmanlike constitutional, indeed political relationship, in which citizens as equals rule and are ruled in turn. It reflected hence for Republican thinkers the best rule in the city, and it was for them the most important ruler-ruled relationship. At the beginning of this talk, I have emphasized the civic humanist's stress on the active citizen, the one who is taking turns with the demands and joys of ruling, who actively participates in the sphere, in the affairs, and in the decision-making of the city, satisfying even to historians today. They also stress justice and rule according to law. And all this now was, through the word of civilis, connected to the political relationship that characterizes the form of rule in the city, the relationship between the citizens, and the relationship that existed between husband and wife. The wife became political, and in consequence, the citizen might become a wife. Of course, Aristotle had said that the wife could never rule her husband, since the ruler-ruled relationship between husband-citizen and wife-citizen was static. Nevertheless, it reflected the relationship between equal citizens in a republic. Acciaioli's comment addressed the problem of why the husband rules over the wife constitutionally, and we can see here how he balanced the idea of civic equality and natural hierarchical subordination, without conflating the category of woman with the category of wife. Quote, it is said that conjugal imperium is like the constitutional rule, but this is not completely consistent, because husband naturally presides over his wife, and there is no change of rule between them, except by some accident. Citizens, however, sometimes rule over their fellow citizens, sometimes they obey the others, according to the change of civil office. For they wish to be equals according to nature. But the masculine is according to nature superior to the feminine, unless something happens, as we have said above. The conjugal rule is nevertheless alike to that equality in this respect, because husband presides in a certain civil presidency and not in a despotic or in a monarchical one. End quote. So by nature, the woman was subordinated to man, and here the language is really masculus et femina. But in the civilized sphere, their relationship becomes a presidentia civilis, a civil presidency that the vir, the husband, presided over. Acciaioli did not necessarily present those as absolute dichotomies, so nature of man and woman, husband and wife were interrelated, but they were not essentialistically determined. The term presidentia civilis brought to the fore that the husband-wife relationship was very much understood in terms of magistrates that jointly ruled according to law. This was about the active citizen in a city-state. Accordingly, Acciaioli also explained that, quote, the husband rules over the wife constitutionally, civilita, like any magistrate in a res publica rules according to laws. And Antonio Montecatini thought that the conjugal relationship was, quote, like that of two magistrates, ille major haec minor, one higher, the other lower, who together rule the house. The civility or the politicalness of the conjugal relationship, in which the wife actively chooses a husband and shares with him the rule of house, is hence emphasized by the commentators. What is striking and needs reflection is that the language that is used to describe the household relationships does not make any difference between the domestic and the political. Both are relationships of imperium. When Acciaioli and others expressed the husband-wife relationship as civilis, this had obviously a host of layers of meanings. But they were all political, to use the term in our modern sense. And all these meanings were also, as our discussion has shown, intrinsically connected to the relationship of husband and wife. In early modern political thought, the relationship of husband and wife is therefore inseparably connected to a discourse of citizenship. And the discourse of citizenship is directly related to a gender relationship. So one directly related to and referred to the other. A civil or political relationship, however, according to Aristotelians, needed equality, which Acciaioli had also attested the wife and husband to have, as we've seen. Lefebvre d'Etaples, commenting on this passage, explained, while it is well deserved that husband presides over his wife, yet among the parts of the household no other relationship is closer to equality, equalitas, than husband and wife, in such a way that it is seen to be similar to a civil regime. The wife was hence her husband's equal, or at least had a status that was rather close to equality. She was nevertheless always hierarchically subordinated. The gender relationship of the household, hence, highlight the nature of the concept of early modern equality. Subordination was not necessarily a signifier for inequality. A citizen in the Aristotelian sense rules and is being ruled in turn, so that of course also among equal male citizens there always was a hierarchical relationship due to their particular functions in the political administration. Citizens in early modern Aristotelianism were equal only in the broadest sense. Equal in relationship to the liberty of the city, in theory having equal opportunities to attain office, but nevertheless bound in a hierarchical order. In a family, husband and wife are of equal status, viewed vis-à-vis their children or their servants, and they also shared the ruling of the house and even the education of children. But this was nevertheless a hierarchical relationship in which the wife was always subordinated. Gender here indeed becomes a central signifier for political concepts, and this is now my end. If we want to assume that early modern Aristotelians had satisfying concepts of citizenship, we necessarily also say that they had a satisfying concept of husband and wife relations. Thinking about gender can enlighten the way we reflect on key political concepts, like citizenship and equality, and thus deepen our understanding of early modern political thought and its terms and their alterity. Similar, paying attention to political language can help us reflect on the categorization of gender relations. Marriage and politics are categories that deeply relate to each other, and it seems that both politics and gender in early modern Aristotelian political thought were unthinkable without the other. So turning our eyes to gender in the history of political thought shows that presumably stable categories are not fixed, but complex, multidimensional, and interrelational. Early modern thinkers did not operate with a simple dichotomy of politics and domestics, masculine and feminine, but also not with those of husband and wife, or nature and culture. Just as in the social worlds in which the writers lived, woman has been shown to not have been a universal category, it neither presented itself as such in the political thinking of the time. The female was naturally subordinated, but the citizen wife was closer to equality. Procreation we share with animals. Marriage is civil and thus political. Nature might have made the woman defective, but it had also made the citizen wife far superior to any non-civic male. Thinkers differentiated sharply between the categories of feminine and masculine, between woman and wife, between man and husband. But of course also they saw them interrelated. These are no new dichotomies. Although nature was a highly important concept, looking at the language they used, these thinkers expressed an understanding, sometimes more than it is expressed today, that biology was not necessarily the justification for every perceived difference between human beings. In a gendered analysis, the domestic emerges as a deeply human sphere, related to the political in a multitude of ways. Gender, however, seems to be also the pivotal point that relates the domestic to the political, insofar as marriage is the most important relationship to explore both the origins and the best rule in the state. And in that sense, women did not have to wait for their inclusion into the political, because as wives, they were already in it. Asking questions about gender helps us structure and rethink the way we think about political concepts and the idea of the political in early modern Europe. Gender really asked for contextualization of seemingly rock-solid assumptions of politics and history, and thus helps us to question our historical narrative. The history of political thought, with its focus on language and discourse, makes this contextualization possible, makes it historically sound, yet highly imaginative, and thus enables us to really grasp the gendered notions of the political. What emerges is that gender is also deeply embedded in the thinking of politics at the beginning of the modern state, in its foundations, in its categories, and in its language. It structured the political, and it was tied to it in a myriad of ways. Gender, hence, is indeed a useful category for the history of political thought. Thank you very much.